Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar that examines the key differences, the DNA, if you like, between sales management and sales leadership. I'm Mark Burbrick, the Managing Director of Peoplogica, and very shortly I will be introducing you to James Michael, our General Manager of Client Services, who will conduct this webinar. Firstly, just some housekeeping. We'll be recording the webinar and we'll make the recording available to you within the next couple of days. As we want to keep to our 30-minute timeline, I would ask that you send any questions you may have via the chat feature, which we will attend to at the end of the question time if the question has not already been attended to by James. Please feel free to tweet any comments using our Twitter handle at Peoplogica, and also on LinkedIn if you'd like to receive our articles and blogs on all things people capital. Too often it is assumed that a manager is a leader. Unfortunately, this is not the case, and as most of you know, leadership is not a role title. Leadership is an attitude that is supported by key behaviours. Above all, to be a true leader, you must be courageous. Over the last 10 years, we've conducted a huge number of psychometric assessments and 360-degree leadership surveys on managers and leaders. It is this research that underpins this webinar. What you will see is that the hard wiring of an individual is one of the greatest determinants of whether someone is a natural leader or whether they will have to work very hard to be a great leader. It is this analysis of core behaviours that allows these job fit assessments to increase the success rate of selecting future high performers by about 300%. On that note, I would like to introduce you to James Michael. James has focused his working life on developing leadership capability and high performance teams through his special forces and business world experience. And he is without doubt one of the most qualified professionals to be presenting this webinar on the differences between sales management and sales leadership. Thank you, James. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening to all of you, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to have you along. Some familiar faces, so good to see you again, or to see you logged in at least. Can't actually see you. And of course, some people who haven't necessarily joined us previously, so welcome to you. As we look at the world of work, traditionally, the model that you'll see in front of you at the moment more or less describes the view that has been tradition, if you like, the way that we go about building this business success for probably the last 30 or so years. In more recent time, however, it's become evident that the culture of the organisation is one of the key enablers, one of the things that really makes the difference between whether any of those other aspects actually have an impact and deliver the business success that you want. And of course, certainly in most recent time, it's become abundantly clear that leadership is one of the defining factors as to whether or not we actually have the culture that we need to deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. So the subject of leadership and management very much on the tongues of almost every business person today, and hence the need for the conversation that we're going to have today. As Mark shared with you, we've been conducting at Peoplogica a whole range of different sorts of surveys and assessments now for a decade, and it occurred to us just recently that we would take a look and just see what are some of the emerging findings that are found in quite a deep analysis of data that we have. And when we look at some of the organisational surveys and we take a look at specifically the sorts of things that are pressing down on businesses today, the list that you see coming up on the screen now pretty much defines it. There's an ongoing expectation of increased performance. Whatever you delivered yesterday is probably good enough for yesterday, but it's not going to be good enough for tomorrow. There's relentless competition, and it's coming from all sorts of strange quarters, very unpredictable, and sorts of the competition that people just had no idea would actually occur to them. And as a consequence of that, there are lots of businesses who are now going out of business. We're being asked to do much, much more with much, much less, certainly in terms of human capital, and the deadlines are just getting tighter and tighter and tighter. What was once fast is now slow. The rest of the list I'll let you read for yourselves, but that certainly describes the sort of environment that we find most of our clients are telling us they're having to deliver results in, and they're needing to lead and to deliver in. The thing that's been interesting for us to observe is that very few leadership programs have yet started to take this into consideration. There's a degree of business as usual, if you like, in a lot of leadership development programs, and yet you and I both know business isn't usual anymore. So what are the other things that are pressing down? What you'll see in front of you at the moment is an image of the inside of an F-18 Hornet fighter jet. And the information that you can see, which is available to the pilot, is vast. And that's not dissimilar to the amount of information that probably crosses your desk in one way or another, whether it's on your iPhone, whether it's in your iPad, whether it's in your PC, emails, chats, you name it. There's a plethora of information which is available on a daily basis that we need to digest in one way or another and then act on. And in fact, the amount of information that's coming across our desk is doubling. That used to double every 7 years. It's now doubling every 3.5 years. So every 3.5 years, you have twice as much information as you had 3.5 years ago to digest and do something with. That's becoming overwhelming for lots and lots of managers, and it's beginning to preoccupy their time. They're spending more time trying to decipher what's written in this email or in this report than necessarily being able to actually take action and lead. What that's showing in terms of some of our time and motion studies is that on average, somebody in a sales manager's role, and I'll use that title as a broad-based description, is spending 1,840 hours per annum in what might be described as management tasks, stabilizing, managing what is, dealing with crises and things of that nature, which is only leaving 360 hours per annum to actually do the leadership side of things. And we'll talk about what leadership means from our perspective in a moment. But the amount of time actually being readily available is only 360 hours per annum, and if you try and amortize that across a year, that would suggest generally an hour a day is available. Not that we're spending 360 hours a day at work, I hope, but an hour a day is all that's being made available to do the things of leadership. And yet there's this pressing conversation around, well, don't we need more leadership? Isn't leadership the defining factor? Something that hasn't changed over time, according to the results in our surveys and our organisational surveys in particular, is the bell curve. The bell curve is alive, well and kicking, and what we're referring to there, of course, is that there is that usual collection of people who are adequate to good performers. Around 50% of your sales team are probably likely to be average to good performers. They're not problematic, but they're not superstars either. And then on either side of that bell curve, you've got that 25% of the sales team who are probably substandard. They're consistently missing target. They seem to not grasp what's required of them, or maybe they're even problematic. They're challenging. Maybe they're resisting change. They may well be some of the people who've been in the sales force for a longer period of time, and they're not coping with what's expected of them today in terms of the changing marketplace. And then, of course, at the other end of the bell curve, you've got that 25% of superstars, those high performers, who often you'll hear we're going to be high performers no matter whether they had a good sales manager or not. So the obvious question, and when we speak with sales leaders and sales executives in organizations, the obvious question that they're posing consistently is, what's the catalyst? How do I actually move that bell curve to the right? How do I get that lump to shift so I've got more people in the very good to outstanding sector? That's the perennial challenge. When we have a look at what it is that's preoccupying sales managers' times, and our 360 surveys are showing this, there's a distinct difference between the preoccupation of sales managers as opposed to sales leaders, and I'll put that list up now. On the left, you'll see what sales managers tend to spend a lot of time focused on. On the right-hand side is what we see the sales leaders preoccupied with. So sales managers, very focused on today. There's a sense of immediacy, a sense of urgency, there's a demand on their time, they've got to do stuff right here, right now, where sales leaders are not only focusing on today, but they're focusing on the horizon ahead of them, so that might be 1 quarter away, and they're focusing yet again on a horizon probably 12 months away. Now, the day and age of being able to plan for 5 years, hence, seems to be gone. It seems that we can't predict that far ahead these days. But sales leaders are not just focused on what's going on today, and they're not being so preoccupied with things that are going wrong, the crises and the disasters, because they're preventing those from happening in the first place. Sales managers tend to have a focus on doing things right. So there's a perfectionism, if you like, and making sure that they're not getting caught out, that they're not doing things incorrectly, where sales leaders have a very strong preference to make sure that we're doing right things. And by that, we're talking about the things that count, the things that are actually going to deliver an outcome. There's a very strong emphasis by sales managers on objectives. So knowing what the number is that I've got to deliver this week, this month, this quarter, very, very strong on that. Sales leaders don't lose sight of that, but what they also emphasize is how. How are we actually going to do that? And is the how that we're using right now actually working or not? And if it's not, how do we execute, how do we actually get to the number, rather than constantly focusing on the number. There's a lot of time spent by sales managers, unfortunately, in administration, and I refer back to the image that we saw of the F-18 cockpit. A huge amount of time, and particularly as CRM has grown in popularity, where we were once led to believe that the advent of the internet and computing would actually take a lot of this drudgery away from us. It seems to be actually creating more. There are more and more reports being required and demanded by sales management, sales executives today, and sales managers seem to have a propensity to actually get lost in that. And that becomes their reason for not actually being out on the road with their people where they're actually needed most. Sales leaders, by comparison, very much about catalyzing what could be, helping people realize their potential. So as a consequence of that, they're focused on development far more than they are on administration. We've spoken to many leaders in recent time who tend to take the view that, hey, I'd rather be told off for getting the report in late over spending time with somebody in the field and actually helping them become better at their job. Hand in hand in that, what we see is the sales managers tend to have a focus of management by exception. So they tend to only come out of their office or away from their desk and away from their probably bigger Mac than everybody else has, and to leave their reporting behind when there's a crisis, when there's a problem. We often see in cultural surveys and organisational employee satisfaction surveys the complaint that management are spending far too much time in meetings, and they're actually only spending time with their people when something goes wrong, when there's bad news to be delivered. Sales leaders, by definition, are managing by wandering around. They're spending time with their people. They're having what we might describe as how's things conversations. They've got an interest in what's going on, where people are at in the sales cycle, what development needs they might need at this particular point in time. The rest, I think, is reasonably explanatory. There's a focus on uniformity by sales managers, keeping things in order and in the way we do things around here. Sales leaders tending to now focus much more on uniqueness, and many of you, I'm sure, will be very familiar with the whole Strengths Finder movement, and a focus on individual strengths and capitalizing on those, as opposed to causing everybody to be homogenized and looking the same. So there's also then very much a them, and we hear sales managers often complaining about those people in marketing, or those people in logistics, and those people in finance. So there's very much a them kind of focus. Sales leaders are much more inclusive, and their language is very much more around we. In surveying sales executives, the people who are in the management or leadership roles of sales teams, when we're asking them what it is that defines a high-performance sales team to them, here are some of the attributes that we tend to see with consistency. They're looking for teams where the incumbent members have a passion to succeed, where they've got an endurance. We all know that we live in difficult times. Doing business, particularly in sales today, is no easier today than it ever has been in the past. Sometimes it's even more difficult, and so we need people who can keep on keeping on in the face of adversity. We're looking for people who've got creativity and ingenuity, and there's a lot of talk today about the need for innovation, and high-performance sales teams tend to evidence a desire and a capability to be creative and ingenious with their solutions. We're looking for salespeople who will exercise self-discipline. So rather than needing to be managed and constantly looked over the shoulder by their sales manager, they're people who actually understand that they've got to follow up themselves, that they understand what their ratios are, and they can manage to those ratios themselves, rather than being kind of held to account, if you like, on their own. The rest of it, again, I won't read it out word for word, but these are the sorts of attributes that we're routinely finding are either in existence in sales teams that are considered to be high performance, or they're much sought after by sales managers. That would be the ideal world. So what are the things that we're seeing sales leaders do? What are their activities? What are the things that we find them spending time, energy, resources on? Well, they're providing a connected strategy. We find that sales leaders are very, very clearly understanding what's the strategy of the business, what therefore does that mean for us in the sales arena, and how do we actually reflect and achieve the organization's strategy. And not only is it a strategy about the organization, but it's a people strategy as well. So, I have clarity as a sales leader about all of the connected strategies and coexisting strategies that meld together. Sales leaders are spending a lot of time out on the road with salespeople, and they're assisting salespeople in the client discovery sessions, or what others might describe as the needs analysis stage. They'll coach on how to pitch, so that they're in the field doing a lot of, and you'll see the bullet point a little later down here, show, tell, do. Let me show you how it's done. Let me tell you why I did it that way. Now you have a go. You do it as well. And constantly using that technique to coach on how to pitch and how to understand client differentiation. So what we're seeing in sales leaders is a presence. Sales leaders are present, they're live, they're actually there with their salespeople, and very much using the show, tell, do kind of process. And what they're also doing, particularly today, we're finding, is they're building commercial insights. So they're helping salespeople understand the commerciality of the sales process and why pricing needs to be the way it is, or why the margins need to be the way that they are, and having an understanding that making a sale at all costs can actually be too costly. So there's a greater degree of commercial education going on for salespeople, rather than just focus on the number, bring me the revenue, we'll deal with the rest. So the behaviours that seem to underpin that. Sales leaders absolutely enjoy coaching and mentoring. They love being out there with their people. What we're seeing with sales managers, by comparison, is an absence. They're missing in action, if you like. There are routine complaints in organisational surveys that we host that management seem to be almost invisible. So sales leaders enjoy coaching and mentoring. They actually enjoy bringing out the very best in their people and giving them the ability to be successful, rather than just thumping a table and demanding it. They're certainly willing to set high expectations, so there isn't a softness necessarily to sales leaders. It's not warm, fuzzy, it's not group hugs and incense burning. It's very much about setting high expectations, but it's then about helping people actually get there. There's a focus on objective measurements. There's absolute crystal clarity about the things that salespeople need to be doing, the activities that they need to be doing, the numbers that they need to actually be bringing back through the door, and there's clarity on that, and it's as objective and as black and white as can be, rather than subjectivity. Importantly, what we're seeing is that sales leaders, and for us at Peoplogica, one of the hallmarks of leadership et al. Is about courage. And sales leaders certainly have courage to take risks. They're prepared to experiment. And in an age where innovation absolutely is vital today, if we don't have the courage to take risks, then we're not going to innovate. We're going to stifle innovation. They have an ability to delegate. Sales leaders don't need to walk around with their underpants on the outside, beating their chests and saying, look how clever I am. They're more than happy to delegate, and they routinely do delegate to other people within the organisation. As we've discussed a little before, they've got a clear understanding of what the organisational strategy is, and there's a consistent commitment from sales leaders. And again, this is something that we hear a lot of complaints about. We hear of people who suffer being in environments where they've got to guess what mood their manager's in today before they then decide whether they should or shouldn't tell them something or invite them out on a sales call at all. Sales leaders, by comparison, are routinely consistent. It's predictable, the behaviour that you're going to experience from a sales leader. Probably importantly within this, and if we go back to the F-18 analogy, what sales leaders have clarity about is the 4 or 5 key things that really count. What are the things that actually determine whether we're going to be successful or not? How do we know that we're actually going to be on target? And what you see on the screen in front of you, most of you are beginning to see this appearing in your motor vehicles. It's called a heads-up display. And of course, the most important thing that a pilot needs to know is where's the ground, particularly when you're doing 1,200 kilometres an hour. Knowing where the ground is probably vitally important. So how low is too low? But what you see on the screen here are the 5 key things that pilot needs to know. Sales leaders are very, very good, and the answer to, what are those 5 things differs from one organisation to the next. But sales leaders, absolutely, they spend time defining what are the 5 pillars, if you like, that are going to make all the difference to whether we're successful or not today. So one of the things that Mark shared with you at the beginning in the introduction was that we run psychometric assessments. And in particular, there's a tool that we use which is known as the Profile Sales Assessment. And with the Profile Sales Assessment, what we create is what we describe as high performance benchmarks. And we're able to actually create a benchmark which is unique to each organisation, and then compare people in roles against those benchmarks and to provide behavioural coaching. What you're about to see is the collective data that's been gathered over the last 10 years on those people who've been considered to be effective sales managers, their DNA, if you like. So what you see here, the tool that we use, the Profile Sales Assessment, or PSA, is what we describe as a multi-construct tool. So it measures three key things. It measures the thinking style, or the cognitive ability of the respondent. It measures the behavioural traits, and it also measures the occupational interests. It's one of a rare few handful of tools in the world that actually measure all three of those in one single test. What you're seeing with the blue squares is where good sales managers land. So I want to point out here, there is such a thing as a good sales manager. So we're not for one moment suggesting that you have to be one or the other. There are situations where either one is actually quite appropriate. So good sales managers, from a thinking style perspective, certainly tend to be above average in their learning index. And so the average in Australia is 5.5 on this scale. So they're above average in terms of their learning index, which is a combination of their verbal skill, their verbal reasoning, the numerical ability, and the numeric reasoning. So they're above average as far as that's concerned. Probably what's more important, the things that we need to focus on, are around the behavioural traits. So what you'll see with good sales managers is that score of 7 to 10 in the energy level is a reflection of their ability to multitask. So sales managers who are good sales managers can handle more than one task at a time, and they're very, very focused on simultaneous actions. From an assertiveness point of view, they're quite assertive, they're present, and their presence is certainly quite clear and known. From a sociability point of view, they do tend to be outgoing and gregarious. They're very, very people person, and they enjoy the company of others. And from a manageability point of view, and this is quite interesting, what we'll find here is that they kind of sit in the mid-range from a manageability point of view. So sales managers, by definition, tend to be slightly more compliant than their sales leader peers, and we'll look at the sales leader model in a moment. So they're going to follow the rules, they're going to follow precedent, and they're going to have an understanding about guidelines, and they'll want to stick to those guidelines. There are some negatives that come with that, and I'll discuss those in just a moment. From an attitude point of view, sales managers do have some degree of cynicism built into them, and so their attitude is not necessarily completely optimistic. They do have a tendency towards pessimism that can result in them asking or making statements around why new ideas and new innovations aren't going to work. We tried that before, it didn't work here. From a decisiveness point of view, and this is a strong point, certainly an area that we've had a lot of complaint about in our culture surveys. Decisiveness tends to err towards the lower side. So sales managers are, by definition, hesitant to make decisions. They prefer to defer to people further up in the decision-making tree before they'll actually go ahead. So there's a degree of patch protection, if you like, or even career protection going on where sales managers are concerned. They don't tend to be particularly accommodating. They're not necessarily as open to new points of view or other people's points of view. Those people who are more inclined towards the sales management side of the spectrum are probably going to be more inclined to be pushing their point of view and not necessarily open to alternatives. From an independence point of view, you can see the scale is actually quite wide, ranging from 5 through to 10. So an average level of independence ranging all the way through to completely independent is not uncommon. And then from a judgment perspective, in terms of how sales managers make decisions, what we found is those people who are considered to be sales managers tend to be quite subjective. What they will often use as a rationale for their subjectivity is that they've got good old-fashioned intuition, they've got gut feel, they know in their guts what's the right thing to do. This particularly comes out when we see sales managers making hiring decisions. They tend to rely on their gut quite a lot. So how does that compare with the sales leader? Again, what you can see on the thinking style, it's exactly the same. There's no real difference in thinking style. Somebody who's going to be successful as a sales leader or a sales manager is going to certainly be above average in their thinking style. However, when we look at the behavioural traits, we do see some difference, and in a moment I'll go to a slide where I'll actually show you both of these combined together. But the energy level is a little lower than that of sales managers. And now that may come as a surprise to you. The thing that's important here is that sales leaders they're still sitting around the 4, 5, 6, so they can multitask. But what they're more inclined to do is pay attention to the detail. They're more inclined to follow through. They're more inclined to be judicious in what plates they're actually going to have spinning. So they won't overload themselves, where sales managers can do that. Their assertiveness is relatively high, so they're going to stand their ground. They're very clear on what it is that they want, and so they'll take the lead in that regard. Sociability is a little lower. So they don't have a great need to interact with others. They're perfectly capable of doing so if needed, and of course we are dealing with other human beings, but they don't have a need for it. So it's not important for them to necessarily be liked. What they're more interested in is being respected. The surprise for us, to be honest with you, is around the manageability piece. So you can see the manageability scores are from 4 and down. And so what we find in sales leaders is they're more inclined towards being rule breakers and rule benders. They tend to subscribe to that notion of better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. And this is where innovation starts to come out. With a lower level of manageability and being rule benders and rule breakers, they're more inclined to look at new ways of doing things, and not just for the sake of it, but because there might be a better way and a more effective way of doing things. The attitude, relatively optimistic by comparison, so there is a greater degree of optimism. Sales leaders do tend to have a focus on strengths and on positives and looking for how things will work rather than reasons why they won't work. Decisiveness is markedly higher. And so you can see here sales leaders will get as high as a score of 10 with decisiveness. These are the people who've got courage. They're going to take the lead. They want an outcome, and they're going to make that happen. The accommodation is a little lower. And so, again, sales leaders aren't really interested in winning hearts and minds, well, from the perspective, certainly, of making friends with people. They're there to demonstrate leadership. They're there to get results. And the key thing about a sales leader for them is it's about respect rather than friendship. Independence, you can see quite a wide scale there, from 5 to 10, so varying degrees of independence being observed all the way through to the highest level possible. And then from an objective judgment perspective, what you're seeing is quite a high level of objectivity coming through, so less subjective in their thinking. So what you see here is the overlay between the two. The yellow indicates where sales leaders are landing. The blue is where sales managers are landing. Where there's an absence of yellow, you'll actually, what that means is the scales are actually both the same for sales leaders and sales managers. So assertiveness, accommodation, and independence. Those 3 stems tend to be much the same between sales managers and sales leaders, but what you're seeing with the yellow is where sales leaders are versus sales managers. So this is really quite interesting. And it's important for us then to understand that, what do I need more of today in my business? Do I need sales managers or do I need sales leaders? If you know what the answer to that question is, understanding whether the person that you have in the team at the moment or the person that you're thinking of bringing into the team as the sales manager or the sales leader, understanding what their natural attributes are, what their hardwiring is going to be critically important. Because obviously the more naturally inclined we are towards a particular way of working, the more likely we are to be successful in that particular role. So this is 10 years worth of data that you're seeing in front of us. One of the things that was on one of the earlier slides, and I just want to help you feel comfortable about, is that the tool that we use, the Profile Sales Assessment, enjoys one of the highest predictive reliability ratings in the world today. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with and probably will even be users of tools like Myers-Briggs, LSI, and even DISC. The reliability of this particular tool, however, far outstrips any of those tools in terms of being able to determine whether somebody will or won't be successful in a particular role or not, to the point that the reliability on this tool sits at what we describe as 0.82. There are no other tools in the world that we know of at this point in time that have that level of reliability. So the data that you see in front of here, I'm going to suggest to you, is actually irrefutable. We've run this survey now for 10 years. It's data on absolutely thousands of individuals, and when we correlate that between what we see in their profile and what we see in 360-degree feedback and what we're seeing in cultural surveys, there's a very strong correlation between those who are described as sales managers and those who are described as sales leaders. So, at this point in time, I'm going to press pause, 9 minutes and 32 seconds, and hand back to Mark as the facilitator and see if there are any questions coming from anybody. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, James. And look, we have a couple of questions here, and we are pretty well out of time. So I'll give James a couple of questions. Any other questions you have, please send through. And what we will do is have James answer them, and we'll send them out with the recording when we send that out to you. James, one of the questions here is: can sales leadership be taught?
Yeah, absolutely. A good question, and it's one of those ongoing questions about leadership and management as well. Yes, it can be taught, but in the same way that brain surgery can be taught, or being a jet fighter pilot can be taught, it can only be taught to those who've actually got some of the at least basic fundamentals. So depending on how far away you are in any of those scales, obviously it's going to make it a little bit more difficult. But one of the great things about the tool that we use, the Profile Sales Assessment, is when we run that for organisations, for client organisations or for consultants and their clients, it provides a coaching report. And so providing a person isn't absolutely at opposite ends of a continuum or a stem, yes, they can certainly learn how to become more effective in sales leadership.
Thank you for that. And another question is: should all of my sales managers be sales leaders?
A good question. I read a book many years ago, and it was called Mind of a Manager, Soul of a Leader, written by a guy by the name of Craig Hickman. And he posed a similar question at the front of his book: what do we need more of today, managers or leaders? A little later in the book you find it was a trick question, because the answer is yes. It really depends on where you're at in your life cycle in your organisation. You know, when we're in a situation where we need to be going into new markets, or we're dealing with changes in our markets and changes in expectations, then absolutely you're going to need more leadership than you need management, because you need people to blaze the trail. However, when we're looking at stabilizing and normalizing and codifying and making sure that we've got something which is consistently able to be replicated, then you're going to need more sales managers. So, you know, the answer to that question really does depend on your organization. So yeah, sometimes we need more sales managers, sometimes we need more sales leaders, sometimes we need even numbers of each.
Thanks, James. And I'll just one last question, and any other questions we'll deal with offline. But James, what are your thoughts on how much a sales leader can move the bell curve?
Yeah, well, that's the great challenge for every sales leader, isn't it? Look, I think the answer to that is, in reality, a little less about the sales leader themselves and much more about the stock that you've got in terms of your sales force. One of the analogies that I like to use is that a donkey is a donkey, and it doesn't matter how much training you give it, it's never going to win the Melbourne Cup. So, you know, whether or not you've got a sales team who can actually shift to the right on the bell curve and bust that bell curve really depends on the inventory that you've got in terms of the quality of the salespeople. And again, that's where this tool, the PSA, helps you identify whether or not you've got that good source material. So ultimately, the answer to that question, Mark, is very much around, well, what's the quality of the salespeople that you've got? And by quality, I'm talking about that innate characteristics, not just the sales process or the training they get given.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to thank everybody for tuning into our webinar. We look forward to hosting you again next month. Next month's topic will be called Leader, Boss or Bastard, which is all about leading Australians, because after all, we're very different to Americans and English, and yet most of the leadership comes from these two countries. So we really want to focus on Australian leadership. In the meantime, please join us on LinkedIn so that you're kept up to date with all things People Capital. And thank you very much, and have a great day. Thank you all.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers, everybody.